Hello, and we continue our journey through Alex Hochuli's Technofeudalism versus Total Capitalism and American Affairs Journal. We're in the section called Deconstructing Feudalism, which is actually a point that I've wanted to talk about myself for a while. Is like, what do people think feudalism is that this techno version is recapitulating other than rents? Because feudalism is a lot more than rents, in so much that it's anything at all, which is a debate in and of itself. Now, I'll defend the category of feudalism with the caveats that it's more than one thing. But let's get into it. Hochuli does as well. While there isn't room to do justice to the theme, it is nevertheless worth noting that feudalism isn't even feudalism anymore. For decades now, medievalists have avoided using the term, with the exception of a few like Chris Wickham and a lot of the British Marxist school who maintain the term but complicate it. It has become less and less popular. Many people I've had on my show have denied it's a valid historiographic category. Some of them have said it's not true. Now, I don't know how a historiographic category can be false like that, unless its criteria are false. But we need to talk about the problems with the term. With empirical research revealing a much more variegated picture than the received ideas imply, particularly the received ideas from the Renaissance or the early modern period. And the Renaissance is another idea we've kind of thrown away. The responsibility for the latter rests on figures like the French historian Marc Bloch, who wrote in the early 20th century. Critics complained that academics of his type generated an image of feudalism that was never coherent and unified as presented. Yeah, I mean, manorialism and signory are feudal oafism are not coherent, nor are there a singular center of law in feudal Europe. And other, what Samir calls tributary modes of production, which I think is almost too broad of a category because it seems to encompass pretty much everything that's not capitalism, also don't work the same way. All right. Bloch conceptualized feudalism quite neatly as a continuum of readily discernible social features. One, a subject peasantry. The wide press use of the service tenement, aka the fief, instead of a salary, which was out of the question. The supremacy of class of specialized warriors, the ties of obedience and protection which bind man to man, and within the warrior class assume a distinctive form called vassalage, fragmentation of authority leading inevitably to disorder, multiple codes of laws, for example. And there were multiple codes of laws operating at any given time. And in the midst of this, the survival of other forms of association, family and state, of which the latter during the Second Feudal Age was to acquire renewed strength. Such then seemed to be the fundamental features of European feudalism. Susan Reynolds challenged this portrayal of feudalism as hierarchical system rooted in vassalage and land tenure, with a legal basis for such being more ambiguous and variegated across Europe, which is true. I do think that this was a lot more variegated than people thought in the early 20th century. For Reynolds, medieval Europe was more marked by a horizontal social bonds between people of the same status. In fact, you wouldn't even necessarily recognize people of a higher status as being the same kind of people as you, the way people within a nation state would. Probably because they didn't even necessarily speak the same fucking language. All right. If this is so, it would make nonsense of feudalism the byword for the hierarchical domination based on extraction. The feudal pyramid, that schoolroom image of the feudal order in which the feudal state was organized hierarchy of feats and powers from the king down to the minor lord, is grossly misleading. It is arguably more in common with pre-democratic capitalism, aka the early modern period of which we base a lot of these things on. The 14th century feels a lot more like that than the 10th century. The story becomes even more complicated when examining the pre-capitalist world outside of Europe. See what I was talking about with Samir and tributary modes of production. If capitalist modernity was a unified system governed by universal laws of motion, pre-capitalist life was characterized by a lack of systemic integration, except, of course, when it wasn't. At most, it amounted to an order in which the primary producer, whether cultivator or herdsman, is allowed to access the means of production while tribute is extracted from him by political or military means. The tributary mode of production, a la Samir Amin, are what the Marxist anthropologist Eric Wolf calls the tributary mode of production. Samir Amin uses it as well. This more nuanced understanding of the feudal era complicates claims, like Dean's, that today we can witness a tendency of something new as emerging in the guise of something old. Either today replicates feudalism as substantial and varied aspects, political, social, economic, and ideological, a difficult claim to sustain, but one that allows the author to pick and choose elements. Or it's a reductionist account, which is prima facie easier to defend, but only works if the case is watertight. And clearly, actually, the case is not watertight. Durand defines feudalism following Brenner as the arbitrary nature of the lord's relationship to serfs and peasants and the extraction through direct force from the latter, not equal exchange via contract. Right. So the move from village and serf labor into agrarian capital, which has wage labor. It is in light of this sort of understanding, for instance, that Varoufakis claims that vassal capitalist app producers live under terror of removal from the techno-feudal Apple store without a need for bailiffs. This isn't very convincing on its own terms, and is less so when you consider ostensible feudal mode of production in the round. For Durand, in feudalism, what is decisive is not the vassal Caesarian relationship, Caesarea, nor the absence of markets, but rather a hegemony of small-scale production with direct producer having access to the means of production, the independent as opposed to socialized nature of production, and the resolution of tension between the landowner and the independent producer through force, because monopolies require force. Although it's even hard to talk about the feudal state as a state exactly, and we'll get back to that later, because while there were feudal states like England and France, they tended to be complicated and geographically bound, and the French state as we know it took not the Carolingians, not the Merovingians, not even the Capetians. It took to about the Bourbons to fully consolidate. All right. On this basis, we understand feudalism's Malthusian trap. Increased production leads to population growth, which leads to shortages and scarcity, which leads in turn to population falling. And, you know, Peter Churchin et al. Have actually proved that there is some truth to this before industrial production, or at least large-scale wage labor. Significant increases in productivity are impossible because the lord extracts the surplus before the peasants can invest. Indeed, surplus is consumed through unproductively through military ventures or through ostentatious displays. And again, we do have some evidence, although it's hard to talk about what it means to talk about GDP growth before modern nation states. But when people like the Keynesian what's his name? Thomas. Oh, God. I remember now. Thomas Piketty. Okay. When people like Piketty tried to model out growth patterns for the early modern and medieval periods, it was closer to what like the Brenner definition would describe, which is a growth of between 1% and 3%. And never more than that. You don't have periods of massive growth and then massive decline of growth rates like you do in capitalism, where in the early capital industrial investment stage, you're seeing GDP growth of like 20. And by the time that's done and things measure out, you're doing good to get 5 or 6%. That's doing really well. But you'll notice that's still higher than what we project that feudal stuff would be. But again, these are based on projections. It's hard to know what that would even mean. Varoufakis notes that if the steam engine had been invented in the pre-capitalist era, in his example in ancient Egypt, The most that could have been expected is that the ruler of Egypt would have been impressed and placed one or more of his engines in his palace, demonstrating to the visitors and underlying how ingenious his empire was. For all the ostentatious and unproductive consumption in today's capitalism, the widespread practice share of buybacks can be understood as part of this. Profits are nevertheless still reinvested in research and development. Isolated peasants under what is known as feudalism had access to the commons, the enclosure of which was a necessary step for the development of capitalism, as landlords could rent land to farmers and a new class of landless were forced to work for others, forcing people into the cities, etc., and off the manors. What commons remains today? Moreover, it's a repeated feature of tech criticism, sometimes in the name of early libertarian frontier spirit of the net, to critique the way the digital commons has been privatized. See the aforementioned Dr. Cory Doctorow are the work of Jaron Lanier. The extraction of data is simply one example, but there are 3 problems with this. First, data is not the same as the pre-modern commons in that it is not exploitable on its own in individual production. AKA, you can't exploit people for data just because data exists. You can't create new value just through the data itself. The data has to lead to some kind of physical something somewhere. Second, unlike pastures or clean rivers, data must be manipulated and combined with other data for it to be useful and productive. The digital commons is not given by nature, but it has been produced by human beings freely, hence Varoufakis' notion of digital serfs who continue to produce for free, even though the products are already privatized. But, you can opt out. A serf can't. Third, even if the enclosure of the digital commons was directly analogous to 16th or 17th century England, it would suggest that we characterize the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution as a moment of renewed capital accumulation or a deepening of social relations, not a departure. The techno-fuedal thesis also rests on a supposed parcelization of sovereignty, both in the pre-capitalist past and in the emergent post-capitalist future. Dean places great emphasis here, noting how the contemporary world is characterized by capital seeking to escape regulation through the creation of special economic zones. Not nearly new at all. Quinn Slobodian's recent work on this being a key reference. Durand likewise notes that in analogy with today, feudalism features a lack of centralization of power in the overlapping seigneuries, which resulted in the fragmentation of sovereignty and the persistence of margins of peasant autonomy. This view at least does not reify the understanding of feudalism as a pyramidal structure, but it risks misreading what is going on today. And I agree with Alex on this. For all the weakening of state sovereignty and the triumph of the multinational corporations, the central motif of globalization theory from the 1990s and 2000s, the infrastructural power of the state only grows, visible in the capacity for mass surveillance and behavioral modification cited by the techno-feudalist. I mean, if anything, I would say they're overstating how much power that these guys have, but nonetheless. The authors under review refer in different ways to the growing nexus between state and capital. Yeah, and that can happen in a polycentric order. The fusion of political authority with economic power. This sits uneasily when in the kind of feudalism where power is dispersed, irregular, and where the ultimate central authority is usually absent or literally traveling around in physical courts that have to show up in your region. Like that's what they did. Books with techno-feudalism in the title end up with a closer depiction of the fantasies of Silicon Valley oligarchs and neo-reactionary government corps than the reality of, say, China's social credit system. The analogy falls short in other respects as well. Feudalism was not a work society. Peasants were independent subsistence producers who worked when they needed to, which was only a third to half of the year because, agricultural cycles are what they are. The world today is characterized by the coexistence of overwork and underwork, the latter arising from the lack of former employment. Permanent activity for the precariously unemployed is the reality. There is no other way to survive. Durand is at least aware of this breakdown in the feudal analogy. Any isomorphism with medieval Europe and Japan is, of course, remote and incomplete, particularly the hegemony of small-scale individual production. AKA, just because you drive Uber does not mean you actually are a small estate. And it definitely doesn't correspond to what you're doing on Facebook. Indeed, Durand notes that the generalized dependence on the owners of Das Kapital is a kind of Pyrrhic victory for Marxism. Economic production is ever more socialized, confirming the long-term tendency Marx already identified in the 19th century. Moreover, the fact that much production happens with huge monopolistic conglomerates in the case of triumph of economic planning, not market coordination via price signals. But that was already true in monopoly capital. Yes, Marx's vindication that takes on a hideous face of generalized crushing of society, but it points to the possibility of a more free and human post-capitalist future under the order of democratic planning rather than an unfree and inhuman existence in the post-capitalist state of perpetual decline. The problem of rent. The predominance of rent in the economy is central to the techno-feudal thesis. For Durand, intangible assets act as barriers to competition and mobility. Investment is not directed to develop forces of production, but instead goes to the forces of predation, or, finance capital. A variety of forms of rent flourish in contemporary capitalism, including IP rents, such as pharma patents, natural monopolies, such as Apple controlling the entire supply chain, dynamic innovation rents, whereby data generated by industrial processes become an object of intellectual property, and accumulated differential rents on intangibles, which can be reproduced by negligible marginal costs. The last is crucial to the argument because tangible and intangible sectors increase in value at differential rates, as do their costs. Therefore, quote, companies that control intangible links in the chain receive a disproportionate share of the gains as the total production increases, because you have less variable capital. This phenomenon might be deleterious to the generalization of wealth across society, but are they indicative of post-capitalism? I mean, wealth being split across society is literally like a Fordism thing. It's like really only Fordism as the only form of capitalism that did a lot of it. Repeatedly, forms of income accruing to capital are treated as rent. For instance, Durand concedes that in the 1990s, shrimparian creative destruction may have been operative on companies invested in R&D and the source of innovation rents. But this trend is now slow and needed new barriers, principally intellectual property, and thus the stimulating of emergence of stagnant feudal type order. But why do you need innovation rents when throughout modern history these have been understood as super profits, aka hyper exploitation, aka what the fuck Lenin was talking about in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism? If rents are going to play such a central role in the narrative about the revenge of the feudal, then rent must be understood in classical terms. Economic rent of this kind, fixated upon by Durand and Varoufakis, is not really a feudal rent at all. It rests in the confusion between the specific and unique nature of land from which rents are due. It should be remembered that land is not a commodity because it cannot be produced. Yep, you can't make more land. It's a fixed asset. A landlord's monopoly on the land is not the ownership of capital. That is, a produced means of production and a social relation affording its owners extractive power over non-owners, which also, by the way, is why owning your home is not capital. It is technically on the sense that you can use it to trade on the market for capital, and thus it acts as a form of capital by transitive property in the modern market, but Marxists would not have recognized it as capital as such because it is not productive, and it isn't a commodity in and of itself. The house is a commodity, but the land itself is not, because you can't improve it. Its valuation is based on competition on rent markets. Because the landowner does not, ipso facto, have the means to realize the value from it. This relation is rather different from that of Varoufakis' Cloudist, who build platforms that, for instance, intermediate themselves between a driver and a rider, a producer and consumer. Orthodox and communists may understand higher than normal profits attainable due to a lack of competition as economic rents. But it is ultimately profit, indicating capitalists, not Cloudists, as the new techno-feudal lords. The contemporary uses of rentiers is broad, capturing everything from Wall Street banks to monopolistic tech firms. As Matt Huber observes from the show, the politics that usually accompany such a broad analysis is one of moralistic opposition to rentiers as to who gain income without having worked for it. The consequences should be obvious. Capitalist activity is remoralized as work, and we are back to understanding profits as wages of superintendence, an understanding that Marx demolished. Huber urges us to maintain an analytical distinction between landowners as rentiers and capitalists as owners as means of production, because they're not the same thing, and Marx actually doesn't equate them to the same thing in Das Kapital. Perhaps we should conceptualize capitalist rentiership as rentiers as profiteering or as profiteers. We can go further, as Eugenie Morozov does in a highly astute critique of the techno-feudal reason that appeared before the books under review were published. Yep, Morozov took this down before these were even put out. Just as rent proper should be distinguished from economic rent securing to capitalists, many activities undertaken by tech giants should be seen as a commodity production rather than mere squanting on assets. Spotify, for instance, sells a very particular commodity, a unique personalized user experience that provides a real-time access to an infinite collection of music. So all data is just an add-on to the main business of Spotify. Its unique music come branded experience commodity. Despite rentiers in the model are the music labels. Spotify is as much a card-carrying capitalist as Henry Ford. Similarly, Google gives away its search commodity for free. In turn, it allows it to sell other highly profitable commodities, access to user screens, and attention to advertisers. Now, none of this is to argue that there are unproductive rentier practices throughout tech firms, for instance, Google's data holdings. But that doesn't mean that it is not a standard capitalist firm. Getting fabulously rich without working used to be the ire of the critics of capitalism, not feudalism. So look at Google, or indeed Standard Oil, and define it non-capitalist because it is wealthier than the actual value it produces is the feud of an analytical error, in particular one that anyone with any relationship to Marxism should make. All right, that's me adding that, but it should be obvious. Through the system, some owners of capital are able to appropriate the surplus value created and extracted elsewhere, and this accrues to capitalists as profits, not as rents. Which is why it grows the GDP. All right. With the techno-feudal thesis resting on a category error regarding rents, the final argument is much less expansive one in line with political capitalism. The problem is that what has so far been treated as expressions of emergent feudalism have, in fact, been features of capitalism at different points and places throughout history. Yep, that's what I've been saying, is you see all these things in capitalism already. And yes, you could say they're remnants of the feudal order, but Marx talks about the remnants of the feudal order being essential to capitalism as they're reappropriated for capital surplus. He talks about it directly. Like, a really existing capitalism might differ in degree, but not in the essence to the Marxian understanding, according to which accumulation of surplus value happens exclusively through economic means. That is, through exploitation, not expropriation. As Morozov argues, a lack of clarity with respect to the precise relation of exploitation and expropriation, and to the extent of which the former is historically redundant, generates the perceived need for the extraneous concept like Harvey's accumulation by disposition, Veblen's predation, Vericoni's cognitive rent, and even Zuboff's extraction of behavior surplus. Likewise, Radley and Brenner's political capitalism, in which elements like tax breaks, privatization of public access, low interest rates, and state spending aim to boost their private industry are cited. Yet all these existed during capitalism's post-war golden age, are actually even in the 19th century, frankly. They existed then too. But Werner Sombart was claiming that the entrepreneurial capitalists were dead like in 1910. James Burnham was talking about that with the rise of the managerial elites in the 1930s. This is a long durée trend, one that Marx even kind of saw. Does not mean we're going to feudalism. A clean separation between political and economic is important to maintain in theory, but this does not exclude empirical recognition of extraction as reality. Yeah, what do you think primitive accumulation was about? Our so-called primitive accumulation. Let me use the correct thing. That is to say, the waxing and waning of nature and the role of political in the economy, effectively the transformation of the state. Isn't each time mistaken for a new mode of production, a new social order? Yeah, I've been saying that for a while. You guys keep on claiming new social orders when the dynamics of capitalism and the market for labor are still existent. On the contrary, the role by the state can be an indication of the health and dynamism of the economic and its laws of motion. Does competition generate labor-saving innovation? How much competition is there within capital? Is there a crisis of valorization requiring politically driven disposition to expand into new areas? There's always a geographic dimension. The global periphery was always a site of acts of dispossession, no more so than through the neoliberal period, i.e. the privatization of land, resources, public goods, and services. It has historically been easier to challenge political acts of expropriation than economic exploitation because of more easily wield moral outrage. After all, the latter is carried out in the guise of formal freedom of contract. This explains, in part, the great apparent militancy of the left-wing and popular politics in the periphery through the turn of the millennium, as compared to the global north, because expropriation really pisses people off. And honestly, this is why there's some third world theories that are kind of incoherent because they're unclear about expropriation and exploitation. Expropriation is really bad, as is things like labor arbitrage and other things that keeps you from being able to be exploited properly. All right, this tendency may also explain the theoretical appeal of techno-feudalism, for it stipulates that something unfair is being done, even according to capitalism's own rules. But capitalism was never fair, ever, like not even a little bit. Dean, in response to Morozov's critique, is resistant to any interpretation which widens the definition of capitalism to include expropriation. Morozov forfeits the ability to distinguish capitalism from feudalism. But this is fanciful. And fuck, Marx didn't do it. Marx talks about this in Capital Volume 2. I mean, but you know, whatever. The biggest Marxists don't read Marx that much anymore anyway. You can tell. The differences are still overwhelming. Commodity production, market dependence, the primacy of formal free labor, the drive to invest in labor-saving innovation, and the compulsion of competition. All are unique features of capitalism. But Dean's argument requires a response here, for she undermines her own case when she writes, feudalism as expropriation is not the whole of the Marxist story. Extra economic coercion isn't simply replaced by exploitation. It accompanies it. Capital comes to overlay, incorporate, and rely on previous economic and social forms, which Marx is very clear on. And even talks about the appropriation of feudal rents in the creation of capitalism. What exactly is the issue then? Yeah, I don't get it either. It seems like special pleading against your own argument. We'll stop here and come back because I have a lot to say about the next section.